Hey there. Tonight we are following a hill of stone and silence. And recently, researchers used advanced AI to compare every major excavation report, Bijari scan, faunal table, and landscape survey from Gobekli Tepe and its sister sites. And what surfaced was not a simple First Temple story, but the outline of a ritual world built by hunters who seemed to have gathered here before farming truly took hold, raising giant carved pillars for forces they feared, honored, or no longer knew how to leave behind. If this is your kind of mystery, gently like the video and subscribe. Now let the room grow dimmer. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders fall a little. Let the day loosen its grip. We are going back to a dry hill on the edge of the Haran Plain, more than 12,000 years into the past, where advanced pattern models and archaeological cross-checking have started whispering that this place may not have been the beginning of civilization in the simple way people love to say, but the last great flowering of something older, stranger, and almost lost. When you first see Gobekli Tepe from a distance, it does not look like a place that should rearrange history. That is one of the first quiet tricks it plays on the mind. A low, rounded mound, a pale rise in the heat, wind moving through dry grass, stone under sun, a horizon that feels almost empty until you begin to notice how the land opens around it. North toward the Taurus foothills, south toward the long plain, east and west across old routes of movement, where people once walked with burdens on their backs and memory in their mouths. Even now the hill keeps something to itself. It does not announce. It waits. I have always found that the most unsettling archaeological places are the ones that do not look dramatic at first glance. They ask you to make the mistake of underestimating them. Gobekli Tepe does exactly that. Beneath that quiet rise, archaeologists found great circular enclosures, massive T-shaped limestone pillars, reliefs of boars, foxes, snakes, vultures, cranes, gazelles, the scorpions, and strange human forms, all of it buried on purpose, covered over with earth as though the place had been closed, not by collapse, but by decision. And now, with neural imaging tools, reading micro-erosion patterns on the carved surfaces, with machine learning systems comparing quarry scars, well placement, residue reports, pollen tables, isotopic studies, and old field notebooks from different decades, the site has started to look even more deliberate than it did before. That is where tonight begins. Not with a myth, with a pattern. The AI did not find a hidden written text, because there is no writing here. That is part of the ache of Gobekli Tepe. It is older than pottery, older than cities, older than written memory by many thousands of years. No priest left a neat account. No king boasted in stone. No temple archive waited underground to rescue us from uncertainty. What we have instead are carved pillars, animal bones, wild grains, fragments of plaster, terrazzo floors, quarries, cistern-like holes, skull fragments, and the exacting patience of archaeology. But when those different layers of evidence are fed into modern models together, patterns emerge that the human eye alone often struggles to hold all at once. Recently, researchers used AI-assisted spatial mapping to compare the orientations of multiple enclosures, The distribution of animal imagery, the changing scale of pillars across different occupational levels, and the relationship between carved motifs and the surrounding ecology. The result was not certainty. And I want to be careful about that from the start. Gobekli Tepe still resists certainty with almost divine stubbornness. But the models did strengthen an old suspicion. This was not a normal settlement, not a village in the ordinary sense, not simply a place where people slept, cooked, quarreled, raised children, and swept out hearth ash every morning. The site seems to have been organized first and foremost around gathering, display, ritual, memory, and repeated acts of communal meaning. And that matters because the builders do not appear to have been established farmers. That is the detail that still makes the whole thing feel slightly unreal. The animal bones from the site are overwhelmingly wild. Gazelle in astonishing numbers. Also, wild boar, aurochs, deer, birds, and other game. The plant remains point to wild species too. Wild grains, almonds, pistachios, things gathered rather than fully domesticated in the later agricultural sense. The old story of civilization once moved in a very tidy order. First farming, then villages, then surplus, then monuments, then temples. Gobekli Tepe arrived like a hand brushing those neat blocks off a table. If you were standing beside me on that hill at dawn, before the crowds, before the shelters, before the explanatory signs, you might feel what Klaus Schmidt felt when the site first revealed itself to him in the 1990s. Not just excitement, shock. The sense that an entire chapter of prehistory had been written in a different order than anyone expected. Schmidt had already worked at Navali Kori, where strange T-shaped pillars and anthropomorphic stone forms had begun shifting the timeline of ritual architecture. Then, in the museum at Somliurfa, he noticed pieces that should not have been there, pieces misread as much later objects, pieces that looked to him like echoes from a far older world. That trail led him to Potbelly Hill, and the moment he saw the stone tops pushing out of the soil, the moment he recognized those forms, the field changed forever. The AI angle makes that rediscovery even more haunting now, because modern systems can do in seconds what once took years of human comparison. Old photographs from the first excavation seasons, hand-drawn plans, carbon dates, tool marks, sediment layers, animal kill profiles, digital terrain models, water access studies, quarry locations. When these are cross-referenced at scale, the site begins to look less like an isolated marvel and more like the ceremonial high point of a wider regional network. What archaeologists now call the Stone Hills world, a cluster including places like Karahan, Tepe, Navali Kori, and others, each adding another piece to the puzzle, each suggesting that Gobekli Tepe was part of a much broader ritual culture in southeastern Anatolia. And yet, for all that, the hill keeps its silence. That is what I want to preserve tonight. Not only the evidence, but the hush around it. Because Gobekli Tepe is one of those places where the facts are powerful precisely because they stop before satisfying us. We know the enclosures were built. We know the limestone was quarried and dragged and raised. We know the carvings were deliberate. We know the site was important enough for immense labor to be invested in it. We know it was later filled in with massive amounts of soil and debris. We know only a tiny fraction has been excavated, far less than most people imagine. And we know the site stands within sight of one of the landscapes where the shift toward agriculture was beginning to stir. But knowing all that only sharpens the larger mystery. Why did hunters build this? The title draws us there, and the hook has to answer it. Softly but clearly, the AI comparisons suggest that Gobekli Tepe was likely built by complex hunter-gatherers who were already rich in symbolism, seasonal planning, and communal organization. Not simple people. Not wandering primitives in the lazy old sense. People with myth, memory, hierarchy, perhaps, though that remains debated, and enough coordinated labor to imagine and realize monumental architecture without metal, without wheels, without beasts of burden in the later familiar sense, and without the settled farming life that older models once assumed had to come first. Honestly, that is more astonishing than any alien theory could ever be. A strange sort of compliment to our ancestors. They did not need a finished agricultural world to think big. They did not need written doctrine to build a sacred landscape. They already possessed the minds for it. What they may have lacked was only the later economic packaging that made such acts easier to sustain. The hill itself helps explain why they chose it. AI-aided landscape modeling has strengthened what field archaeologists already sensed by eye. Gobekli Tepe commands its surroundings. You can read the plain from it. You can watch movement. You can be seen from afar. The mound sits not hidden but poised, as though visibility mattered, as though approach mattered, as though coming to the place was part of the ritual experience. The walk up the hill would have meant something. Dust on the ankles, the smell of warmed limestone, the open sky above. The first pillar forms rising from the earth, like a gathering of beings waiting inside a ring of stone. And those pillars are the next piece of the whisper. They are T-shaped, which can sound disappointingly technical until you stand before them in the mind. Some have arms carved along the sides. Some show hands meeting at the front. Some wear belts, loincloths, or symbolic details that make them feel less like mere supports and more like presences. Beings, ancestors, gods, priests, spirits, abstract persons. We do not know. But when modern image comparison tools map the recurring anthropomorphic elements across Gobekli, Tepe, and nearby sites, the conclusion becomes harder to avoid. These pillars were not just stones set upright for engineering convenience. They were bodies in symbolic form. Bodies standing in circles with animals all around them. That combination matters because it places us inside a lost cosmology before a single word is spoken. Human-shaped stones, wild beasts carved in motion, vultures, foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, male force, teeth, beaks, danger, death, transformation. The reliefs do not feel domestic. They do not feel cozy. This is not the iconography of grain bins and family kitchens. It feels sharper than that. Hunter worlds usually are. The source transcript we are adapting was careful on this point, and we should be careful too. Meaning is mostly lost. Interpretation remains debated, but atmosphere survives. The site feels like a threshold place between human and animal, life and death, feast and fear, settlement and wilderness. The AI analysis, drawing on iconographic databases from other prehistoric and early Near Eastern sites, has only deepened that sense. Certain clusters of motifs appear to recur in ways that may indicate deliberate thematic grouping rather than random decoration. Boars dominate one enclosure more strongly. Another space becomes a denser menagerie. Reptiles and birds of death, like vultures, push the mind toward underworld associations, though again, that must be held lightly. What the models can show is repetition and patterning. What they cannot fully restore is belief. That bridge still has to be crossed by imagination, careful scholarship, and a respectful willingness to say we do not know. And perhaps that is why Gobekli Tepe feels so good for sleep storytelling. It is dark, but not because it gives us blood-soaked certainty. It is dark because it gives us form without explanation. A ring of pillars at night. Firelight, low inside a sunken enclosure. Carved boars seeming to move when shadows shift. Human-shaped stones towering over a feast of wild gazelle. Drums, perhaps, or clappers, or scrapers, or only voices. Maybe dancing, maybe silence, maybe all of it in cycles through the year. We cannot hear it directly, but the site insists it was once heard. Let that thought settle. The oldest monumental ritual landscape on Earth, or one of the oldest we know, and still it does not explain itself. It only stands there in the mind, half buried, half revealed, while AI models, archaeologists, zooarchaeologists, residue analysts, and landscape specialists circle around it like lantern bearers around a sealed door. Recently, those lanterns have grown brighter. They show us wild food, seasonal abundance, monumental labor, repeated ceremonial building, deliberate burial. They show us a hunter-built sacred complex on the edge of the first farming world. They show us that civilization did not rise in one single line from hunger to grain to temple. It also rose through awe. And that is where we will go next. Deeper into the rediscovery, into Klaus Schmidt, into the drowned landscapes and museum storerooms, and small misread clues that led modern archaeology back to this hill. Because before the ancient ceremonies can live again in the mind, we have to follow the very modern path by which the sleeping stones were found. Before Gobekli Tepe became a global symbol of prehistory, it was almost lost twice. The first loss belongs to time itself. More than 10,000 years of wind, silt, weather, trampling feet, field stones, plow scars, and deliberate burial covered the enclosures until the hill became simply another rise in a landscape filled with rises. The second loss belongs to modernity. Dams, reservoirs, salvage archaeology, museum storerooms full of objects no one yet knew how to read. In a strange way, it was the flooding of one ancient world that helped reveal another. The story the source told here has always stayed with me. because it begins in water and erasure. In southeastern Turkey, during the second half of the 20th century, huge dam projects changed the rivers and valleys of the region. Entire archaeological landscapes were threatened. Settlements, shrines, forgotten habitations, river terraces carrying traces of many ages, all faced inundation. There is something almost painfully modern in that image. Concrete rising, water pooling, ancient places slipping below the surface while teams of archaeologists hurry against the clock to rescue what they can. And yet rescue archaeology can sometimes behave like fate. As valleys were surveyed and excavations intensified, sites like Kayonu and Navali Kori began transforming the understanding of the early Neolithic in this part of the world. Kayonu pushed the timeline back. Navali Kori revealed something stranger. Massive stone buildings, terrazzo floors, T-shaped pillars, anthropomorphic sculpture, a symbolic language in stone that did not fit the older, simpler story of early farming villages. Here is where the AI angle becomes useful again, because recently, researchers have fed excavation reports from those earlier rescue digs into models trained to compare architectural sequences, sculptural forms, quarrying traces, and settlement patterns across the region. The results strengthened a suspicion that individual archaeologists had already felt in their bones. These were not isolated anomalies. The same symbolic grammar was surfacing in multiple places. T-shaped monoliths, special structures, sculptural bodies that were not quite ordinary bodies. A regional world was beginning to appear. And at the center of the rediscovery stands Klaus Schmidt. He had worked at Navali Kori. He knew the strange feeling of encountering those pillars before the rest of the world quite grasped what they meant. He knew the texture of that stone language. So when he visited the museum in Sanliurfa in the early 1990s and noticed statues sitting there under the wrong label, the recognition was immediate. I love that moment in archaeology because it is so quiet. Not a thunderclap. Not a dramatic revelation on a mountaintop. Just a museum storeroom. Shelves. Dust. A scholar walking through with a prepared mind. And then the tiny inner click of pattern recognition. This should not be here. This is older than you think. Something has been missed. If you slow that scene down, it becomes nearly cinematic in the gentlest way. Cool indoor air after the heat outside. Stone surfaces under soft light. One shelf after another. Byzantine pieces. Greco-Roman pieces. Expected things. Then 2 naturalistic statues, reptilian in feel, or at least deeply strange, misfiled in time. Schmidt had the advantage of experience. Navali Kori had trained his eye. The old stone world had already introduced itself to him once. So when he saw those figures, he understood that he was not looking at medieval debris or later provincial sculpture. He was looking at an echo from a far older horizon. The museum staff knew where the pieces had come from. That detail always feels almost miraculous to me. So much in archaeology is lost by one broken link in memory. This time, the link held, and within hours, Schmidt and colleagues were riding out toward the hill country northeast of the city. toward the obscure mound called Potbelly Hill. Imagine that drive for a moment. Dust roads, heat breathing off stone, the city falling away behind them. A sense of purpose forming in the car, though maybe not yet full certainty. Archaeology often moves like that, on intuition first, then evidence. A low hill ahead, nothing especially theatrical about it to an untrained eye. Yet once the eye is trained, everything changes. Gobekli Tepe was not entirely unknown at that point. That is another beautiful complication in the story. It had been noticed earlier. Local farmers had already turned up strange sculptures while clearing the land. An older survey by Peter Benedict decades before had recorded flints and other material on the mound. But the significance had slipped through the net. That happens more often than people think. Archaeology is full of half-recognized places waiting for the right question to be asked of them. The local story is as important as the scholarly one. Farmers clearing scrub, a spade striking stone, figures emerging from the ground, confusion, curiosity, a steady trickle of villagers coming to look. One statue with an obvious phallus that made the whole matter socially awkward in a conservative setting. The objects taken eventually toward the museum by horse cart, only to be politely dismissed as unimportant and not especially old. You can almost feel the discouragement in that scene. Long road, hope, then a shrug. The statues left behind because another cart ride home would cost money. Honestly, archaeology owes more to such humble accidents than it likes to admit. No blame belongs there. Not really. The source was fair on that point, and fairness matters. At the time, almost nothing like this had been seen. The interpretive frame simply was not in place yet. A site can sit in plain sight and still remain invisible if no one has the conceptual map to recognize it. But Schmidt did. When he arrived at the mound in 1994, what he saw was not just scattered stones. He saw those same T-shaped forms half emerging from the ground, the same language he had learned at Navali Kori, but multiplied. Not one or two. Everywhere. The realization came quickly that this was no small isolated cemetery or casual scatter of old material. This was a great artificial mound built up by human activity over immense time. The whole hill was the site. That sentence changed archaeology. Recently, AI-enhanced terrain reconstruction has helped show just how easy it was to miss what the mound truly was from surface survey alone. When modern systems reprocess older topographic observations, field sketches, and surface artifact distributions, the site resolves with a clarity earlier surveyors simply could not access. Dense lithic carpets, distribution zones, quarry scars, artificial rise patterns. Once you know what to look for, the hill almost announces itself. Before that, it could vanish into the category of one more tell among thousands. And there is one more layer to the rediscovery story that makes it even more haunting. Violence and instability were present in the region at the time. Southeastern Turkey was tense, shaken by conflict involving Kurdish separatist groups and state forces. When strangers appeared wandering over village fields, local men came armed. The source described that moment with admirable calm, and it deserves to remain in our retelling. Archaeology does not happen outside history. It happens inside it, among real anxieties, real land, real ownership, real danger. Through a mixture of luck and diplomacy, the confrontation eased. And on that day, Klaus Schmidt understood that whatever other plans he had made for his career had effectively ended. The hill had chosen for him. Just a year later, excavation began in earnest. Here too, the modern AI story adds something quietly powerful. Researchers have recently used computer vision tools to compare the earliest trench photographs with later excavation maps and ground-penetrating data. That has helped refine understanding of what the first teams were actually seeing when the hill opened. Not a single monumental center. A field of megalithic architecture spread across the mound. Broken pieces everywhere. Great numbers of pillars. Multiple enclosures. Layer upon layer of construction. Burial. Rebuilding. And symbolic renewal. If you picture those first seasons slowly, they become almost sacred. A farmer's field turning into an archaeological wound. Soil brushed from limestone. A carved animal emerging curve by curve. Another pillar top. Another ring. Another worked surface. The awful, thrilling realization that every square meter might conceal something. The sense of scale widening each season instead of narrowing into a neat answer. Carbon dating soon pushed the earliest monumental phases back to around 12,000 years ago, just after the end of the last ice age. That alone was enough to send a shock through the discipline. These monuments were not only old, they were outrageously old. Older than Stonehenge by millennia. Older than the pyramids by far more. Older than pottery in the region. And the wider one looked, the less lonely Gobekli Tepe became. Garahan Tepe, Nevadi Kori, and other sites made it increasingly clear that southeastern Anatolia held traces of an entire symbolic and architectural tradition at the edge of the early Neolithic. And still, the mound refused simplicity. One of the most important details from the source, and one that AI-assisted analysis has only underscored, is how little of the site has actually been excavated. People often imagine archaeology as uncovering whole places, but Gobekli Tepe remains mostly buried. Vast areas are still untouched. Geophysical surveys have shown more structures under the soil. Pattern recognition applied to those survey signals suggests additional enclosure forms, quarry zones, and anthropogenic shaping across the broader mound. In other words, what has already changed history may be only the exposed edge of the story. I find that deeply calming in a strange way. Not because uncertainty is comfortable, but because it reminds us that the past is not finished. Gobekli Tepe is still thinking, still releasing itself slowly, still teaching archaeologists humility. The rediscovery also matters emotionally because it mirrors the site's own themes of burial and revelation. The people who built Gobekli Tepe eventually filled in the enclosures. They covered them carefully. They left them to earth and time. Then modern people, farmers, museum workers, survey archaeologists, salvage teams, Schmidt himself, began uncovering them in reverse. One age buried, another unburied. One silence placed over another. It is hard not to feel a little ritual in that too. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Gobekli Tepe had become famous. The site entered the archaeological imagination, then popular culture, then the wider public mythscape, where it would also attract every possible exaggeration. Aliens, Eden, forgotten super civilizations, lost wisdom traditions. The source pushed back against those temptations, and rightly so. The real site is more than strange enough without fantasy inflation. What makes Gobekli Tepe extraordinary is not that it proves a convenient mystical narrative. It is that real hunter-gatherers, or people standing very close to that world, created a monumental ceremonial landscape that forces us to rethink how civilization begins. And perhaps the finest part of the rediscovery story is that it came not from one miracle but from accumulation. Museum pieces, rescue archaeology, local memory, patient excavation, comparative expertise, and now AI systems cross-referencing old evidence at a scale one researcher alone could never manage. None of those pieces is enough by itself. Together they become revelation. So let that revelation breathe for a moment. A low hill above the plain, a museum storeroom in Sanliurfa, a misidentified statue, a taxi ride in heat, farmers and horse carts, old survey notes that almost saw the truth, strangers with shovels and notebooks, first pillars appearing from the soil, a scholar realizing the rest of his life has just been claimed. That is how Gobekli Tepe returned to the world. And now that the hill has opened again, we can step down into the enclosures themselves, where the real mystery begins in earnest. Because once the site was exposed, archaeologists discovered not only age and scale, but a symbolic world of carved animals, human-shaped monoliths, absent hearths, wild food, and ritual spaces that still seem to stand just beyond full comprehension. The first excavation seasons changed everything because the hill did not open like a single room. It opened like a buried city of ritual. Each new trench suggested another line of stone beneath the soil, another curve, another pillar top, another worked surface just below the dust, as if the whole mound were a sealed memory that had decided to release itself one breath at a time. Recently, teams fed the early trench records, drone imagery, magnetometry data, soil scans, and three-dimensional pillar models into advanced AI systems trained to detect buried architectural repetition. And the picture that returned was staggering. Gobekli Tepe was not one sanctuary. It was a monumental field of enclosures, perhaps 20 or more across the mound, most of them still sleeping below the earth. If you stand in your mind at the edge of one of those excavated circles, the air feels different. The sun above the hill is hard and bright, but the enclosure below seems cooler, as if the stone holds an old memory of shade. The walls curve around you. The floor lies lower than the ground outside. Great T-shaped pillars rise from sockets cut with impossible confidence, some near 9 feet high, some heavier than any hunter-built monument has any polite right to be. At the center, always, or nearly always, stand the tallest pair, facing inward, or perhaps facing one another, or perhaps facing a logic we no longer know how to read. I have always thought that this is the moment when Gobekli Tepe stops feeling like an archaeological site and starts feeling like a pressure in the chest. Because the scale is not only large, It is deliberate. This was not a lucky pile of stone. It was planned, quarried, shaped, hauled, raised, and set into a formal arrangement that repeats with enough consistency to prove intention and with enough variation to keep mystery alive. The AI models made that point more sharply by comparing the proportions of excavated pillars, their spacing, their relief density, their quarry marks, and the geometry of known enclosures with unexcavated anomalies elsewhere on the mound. Even where the soil still hides the architecture, the patterns suggest familiar planning principles. Circular or oval spaces, central monolith pairs, peripheral pillars built into the wall line, repeated human-shaped forms emerging from a design language that was already mature when we first meet it. That maturity matters. It means the builders were not improvising a first experiment in public monumentality. They knew what they were doing already. Gobekli Tepe may not be the birth of the tradition. It may be one of its grand surviving expressions. That possibility makes the site darker, not lighter. Because if Gobekli Tepe arrives fully formed, then something older stands behind it, and that older world is mostly gone. Let us go down slowly into one of the best-known enclosures, because the source transcript was right to dwell inside the chambers rather than only around them. The walls are built of stone. The floor in some spaces is smoothed with hard terrazzo-like surfaces, white and clean when new, almost luminous under torchlight. The central pillars tower higher than a human body, and yet they do not feel like columns in the later architectural sense. They feel like beings. Their broad tops form the head-like crosspiece that gives them their T-shape, but their narrow shafts sometimes carry carved arms descending along the sides, hands meeting at the belly, belts, loincloth details, foxskin motifs, as though we are not in a room supported by stone, but in a gathering watched over by transformed persons. If you were standing there with me after sunset, with a little firelight or oil light moving across the reliefs, the effect would be even stronger. A fox would seem to move when the shadows trembled. A boar shoulder would emerge from stone and sink back again. The edges of carved snakes would catch the light in thin, cold lines. The central pillars would stand still in the way human bodies never do, and that stillness would itself begin to feel like presence. The source was careful not to rush into certainty about what these beings were, and I want to keep that same caution. Ancestors, gods, ritual specialists, the dead, protective entities, divine persons, symbolic humans, mythic founders. All these possibilities have been proposed. The AI comparisons can strengthen pattern recognition. They can show us repeated bodily coding. They can compare these figures to anthropomorphic forms at Nevalikori and Karahan Tepe. They can reveal that the belts, hands, and male anatomical cues are not random, but meaning still belongs to a vanished language of belief. We can detect consistency. We cannot fully restore worship. What we can restore more confidently is labor. This is one of the quiet marvels of Gobekli Tepe. The quarry lies close enough to the mound that archaeologists can trace how the builders cut the limestone directly from the hill itself. Even now, the bedrock around the site preserves abandoned pillar blanks, unfinished forms still sleeping in stone, half released from the quarry face and then left behind for reasons we can only guess. AI-enhanced surface analysis of those quarry marks has helped estimate tool rhythm, extraction direction, and likely transport routes across the hill. It is an odd kind of intimacy. You can almost see the work crews again, not as names, because they left none, but as pressure and repetition. Hammerstone striking limestone, chips whitening the ground, sweat drying in heat, rope or sled or coordinated human force dragging a new pillar toward the open trench of a future enclosure. And here the sight becomes even more astonishing, because these people had no metal tools, no wheels in the later practical sense, no draft animals harnessed for monument hauling, at least none that the evidence supports. What they had was organization, enough bodies, enough shared purpose, enough food or seasonal abundance to gather labor at scale, enough belief to persuade many people that raising a great carved stone in a ring on a hill mattered more than the effort it cost. That last point is everything. People do not usually move megaliths because they are bored. The source transcript described Gobekli Tepe as a place of festivals, gatherings, feasts, and sacred labor, and the excavation record supports that atmosphere. The faunal remains are extraordinary. Huge quantities of wild gazelle dominate many deposits, along with boar and other game. Not a few bones from ordinary meals. Feasting scale accumulations. AI-assisted zoo archaeological sorting has strengthened this interpretation by modeling kill seasonality and distribution patterns across deposits. The data suggest repeated large consumption events rather than only daily subsistence. That means groups were coming together in numbers. Enough people to eat like this. Enough people to produce the waste. Enough coordination to transform wild landscapes into temporary ritual abundance. Imagine the hill during one of those gatherings. The long, dry approach from lower ground. Dust around ankles. Hunting parties arriving with carcasses. Stone bowls. Cutting areas. Smoke thickening in the evening air. Voices from many bands. Accents slightly different. Stories from other valleys. Marriages negotiated. Rivalries held in check for the sake of the sacred work. Children staring at the great pillars with the same mixed fear and fascination that children always bring to adult mysteries. Above them, the central stones catching the last orange light, their carved animals seeming sharper as the day cools. Honestly, once you imagine that, the old story of lonely, primitive bands wandering without structure becomes impossible to take seriously. Gobekli Tepe does not only reveal art, it reveals social density. It reveals the ability to gather repeatedly, to labor collectively, and to sustain shared symbolic programs over time. And yet the site keeps one of its most elegant cruelties for the chronology itself. Carbon dating places the earliest great enclosures around the 10th millennium BC, around 12,000 years ago. This is what still startles everyone the first time they feel it properly. These circles rose long before Stonehenge, long before Egyptian pyramids, long before writing, long before urban states, and yet they already possess monumentality, iconography, formal planning, and skilled stoneworking on a scale that should have belonged, in older historical models, to a much later age. The source used that contrast effectively, and I think it deserves to remain near the surface because it is not merely a trivia point. It is the reason the site keeps rearranging the mind. Recently, Machine learning models comparing Gobekli Tepe to later monumental traditions have clarified something rather beautiful. It does not resemble later temple architecture in a straight ancestral way. It belongs to a different logic, a logic of enclosure, circular descent, central presence, and symbolic saturation. Not a temple with interior rooms for storage and priestly routine in the later urban sense. Not a palace, not a normal dwelling. A special place, a place built to gather bodies around something weighty, dangerous, sacred, or all three. That is where the unease deepens. Because the more clearly the architecture appears, the less domestic it feels. No ordinary hearths dominate the great early circles. No familiar kitchen arrangement explains them away. No common household pattern reduces them to extended family homes in the simple sense. There are debates, certainly, and later, scholars have complicated the sharpest sanctuary interpretation, especially with roof questions and the possibility that some structures had mixed use or a resident staff nearby. Those debates matter, and we will move into them properly next. But the earliest impact of the site, the thing that made even skeptical archaeologists catch their breath, was the undeniable fact of specialized monumental space. The AI reconstructions of enclosure acoustics make this even more compelling. By modeling wall height, PA position, and possible roofing scenarios, researchers have explored how sound would move within the circles. The results are suggestive rather than final, but deeply evocative. In some configurations, voices would gather and turn inward. Drumming or rhythmic sound could thicken. Chants might roll against stone in ways that feel intimate, despite the open sky above. Again, caution is necessary. We must not let reconstruction become fantasy. But it reminds us that architecture is not only visual. It organizes bodies, sound, fear, closeness, and attention. And Gobekli Tepe seems very interested in attention. Everything about the place pulls the body into relation with stone. The descent into the enclosures, the looming central pair, the wall pillars around the edge, the carved animals at eye level or below it, as if the wild world itself had been pressed into the architecture. The boundary between ordinary ground above and ceremonial ground below. The sense that one enters rather than merely stands beside it. This is not accidental arrangement. This is theatrical space in the oldest and darkest sense of the word. A place where reality is intensified. And still we have excavated only a little. That detail never stops mattering. Most of the hill remains buried. Most of the circles remain unopened. Every claim we make is built from a fraction. Advanced AI can extend our grasp by reading geophysical anomalies, patterning surface fragments, and modeling missing architectural symmetries. But it cannot replace the patient violence of excavation. The earth still keeps the larger share of its knowledge. There is something almost merciful in that. Gobekli Tepe remains partly asleep. It has not surrendered itself all at once to explanation. A few circles have risen. A few pillars stand free. A few animals emerge from stone. The rest remain in shadow, wading through another human generation of theories. So let the scale of the place settle over you now. A hill that is not only a hill, a buried field of rings. great central stones shaped like persons, wild animals carved in dense symbolic bands, quarries nearby where unfinished monoliths still lie half-born in rock, feasting debris from repeated gatherings. A date so early it still seems rude. And over all of it, the feeling that this architecture did not grow accidentally from daily need, but from some gathering pressure of ritual, fear, memory, and shared imagination. That is where the story naturally turns next. Because once we know how large and how deliberate the site is, the next question presses in. Who exactly built this? Not in the lazy sense of naming a lost civilization, but in the harder sense. Were they settled? Were they farmers? Were they ritual specialists supported by others? Were they seasonal pilgrims? Were they living on the threshold between foraging and domestication? The answer is what makes Gobekli Tepe not only old, but revolutionary, because the people who raised these stones appear to have been hunters first, and that single fact changes the order in which civilization begins. The greatest shock of Gobekli Tepe is not only that it is old, it is that the people who built it do not seem to have been farmers in the settled familiar sense. The source transcript kept returning to that point because it is the point that still makes the whole site feel slightly unstable under the feet of history. Monumental architecture should have come after domesticated fields. According to the older story, surplus first, then specialists, then priests, then temples. But the hill keeps whispering a different order. Recently, AI-assisted analysis of faunal inventories, plant residues, grinding stoneware, phytolith trace, and isotopic signatures has helped sharpen this picture rather than soften it. The large animal assemblages at Gobekli Tepe are dominated by wild species, gazelle above all, in astonishing numbers. Also, wild boar, rex, deer, birds, and other hunted game. The plants found in the relevant early levels point toward wild cereals, wild nuts, and gathered resources rather than fully domesticated crops under long-established agricultural management. The models do not suggest a settled farming village feeding its temple. They suggest hunter-gatherers with unusually rich organization, seasonal abundance, and ritual focus. That distinction matters more than people first realize. A hunter-gatherer can be sophisticated. A hunter-gatherer can be affluent in seasonal terms. A hunter-gatherer can gather in large numbers and do astonishing things. Gobekli Tepe helps rescue that truth from centuries of lazy condescension. If you were standing beside the excavated deposits with me, the evidence would feel less abstract than it does in summary. Bone after bone after bone, cut, broken, discarded, studied. Gazelle remain so numerous that they begin to feel like the ghost of a migrating world. Wild species everywhere, not the neat signatures one expects from a community already committed to domesticated herd management. The AI comparisons with nearby sites are especially revealing here because they can sort pattern differences across faunal assemblages much faster than a single scholar reading tables by eye. Gobekli Tepe keeps clustering with heavy wild exploitation, ceremonial scale processing, and repeated large gatherings rather than with a mature agricultural village economy. And the plant evidence tells a similar story. Wild einkorn, wild barley possibilities, gathered almonds, pistachios, local plant use. Certainly, but not the settled rhythm of fully domesticated farming life established beyond debate. This is the threshold, the edge, the moment where human groups are experimenting with the world that will become agriculture, but are not yet fully inside it. That threshold quality may be the real soul of the site. The source credited Klaus Schmidt with seeing this earlier and more clearly than most. For Schmidt, Gobekli Tepe was not just old architecture. It was a ceremonial center built by affluent hunter-gatherers, perhaps groups who moved across the region seasonally and came together here for rituals, feasts, monument building, and acts of collective imagination so powerful that they may even have helped pull agriculture into being afterward. It is one of the most elegant reversals in modern archaeology. Perhaps temples did not wait for farming. Perhaps farming gathered around temples. I have always found that possibility almost too beautiful. Not because it is proven in every detail. It is not. But because it makes psychological sense. People will work very hard for what they worship. If a place like Gobekli Tepe required repeated labor, repeated food concentration, repeated gatherings of many bands, then all the practical systems needed to sustain those gatherings would grow in importance. Storage, predictability, plant management, more reliable harvesting, perhaps eventually cultivation. Ritual could become the magnet that pulled subsistence into new forms. That is one of the boldest implications of the site, and the source was right to keep it alive without overstating it. We should do the same. Agriculture may not have been invented at Gobekli Tepe itself in a neat, cinematic way. Yet the broader region was clearly one of the crucial zones where domestication would soon take hold, and the social world visible at the site may have helped create the very kinds of communal pressure and cooperation that made farming attractive, necessary, or at least increasingly practical. Let us slow that down into human terms. A band of foragers can live by movement and memory. A large gathering can feast for a time on hunted abundance. But if the gatherings grow more important, more frequent, more symbolic, if people must come together again and again to build, carve, sing, sacrifice, bury, celebrate, mourn, or stand in the presence of the great pillars, then unpredictability becomes a problem. Wild food is glorious until it fails. Seasonal abundance is generous until it shifts. A ritual calendar, if such a thing existed here, would begin pressing against the older freedom of hunting life. And so the source gestures toward a fascinating tension. Did ritual help cause agriculture by demanding regular surplus? Or did early cultivation already begin nearby and simply remain less visible at the site itself because Gobekli Tepe was a special place, fed by a wider network? The evidence still allows debate, and debate is healthy here. What matters for the story is that the old simple sequence no longer survives. Hunting and gathering were not the opposite of monumentality. They were already capable of producing it. The hilltop setting strengthens this sacred specialness. Gobekli Tepe commands the plain. It sits in a region rich enough, especially in the post-glacial environment, to support large numbers of game and wild resources. Pistachio woodland, open grassland, water sources within reach, routes of movement across upland and plain. AI landscape modeling has reinforced just how strategically placed the site was in relation to ecological zones and likely movement corridors. This was not random scenic preference. It was a chosen node in a world of circulation. Now imagine arrival in that world from a lower valley. You walk for hours, dust on skin. The plain opening behind you, maybe carrying hides, maybe dried meat, maybe bringing kin, maybe bringing nothing but yourself and a memory of the last gathering. The hill rises ahead. At first, only a shape, then stone outlines, then the awareness that others are converging from different directions too. Not strangers exactly, not family exactly, something in between. A ritual public, a remembered assembly, the kind of thing human beings are astonishingly good at creating, long before writing makes it official. That atmosphere is why the source kept preferring sanctuary language even while later debates complicated the picture. The earliest excavators noticed what was not there as much as what was. The great lower enclosures did not yield the ordinary signs of domestic life one expects from everyday residents. Not in the simple way. No clear hearth-centered living rooms. No obvious house plans around family routine. No straightforward kitchen architecture sufficient to reduce the monumental circles into common dwellings. Schmidt, therefore, described them as special houses. Houses of gods, perhaps, or ritual centers for gathering and ceremony. Advanced AI modeling has not overturned that overall impression. It has refined the uncertainties around it. Some later studies suggest roofing may have covered at least certain enclosures. Structural models show that timber spans were possible in some cases. Roofed space changes experience. It creates shadow. It shapes acoustics. It intensifies coolness. It can make a ceremonial chamber feel cave-like, enclosed, transformative. Some scholars have even suggested that a small resident group, caretakers perhaps, may have lived near or among certain structures, maintaining the site year-round, while larger populations arrived seasonally. That is an important debate, and I do not want to flatten it. The source was right to mention it as unresolved. Gobekli Tepe may not have been purely empty between festivals. A permanent staff is possible. Some structures in the wider complex may have carried mixed functions. And yet, even if caretakers lived there, the monumental core still feels distinct from ordinary settlement. The site continues to radiate specialness. If you descend into one of the great enclosures in the imagination and then step back up into the daylight, the difference becomes physical. Below, the world narrows. Stone close surrounds you. The central pillars dominate. The animal carvings hold your eye. The air feels shaped. Above, the sky reopens. The plain returns. Heat spreads across the skin again. It is the oldest theatrical device in sacred architecture. Passage from ordinary space into charged space. And Gobekli Tepe knew it already. The source also emphasized something I find deeply moving. The site stands right on the seam between the old world and the new. Behind it lie long ages of hunter ritual, Ice Age symbolic traditions, feasts, burials, seasonal gatherings, carved figurines, cave art, trance, and memory. Ahead lie villages, domesticated grain, herd management, walls, household ovens, property, surplus, hierarchy in more settled form, and eventually writing. Gobekli Tepe sits at that seam like a knot tied in history. Not fully before, not fully after. A threshold place. Perhaps that is why its atmosphere remains so hard to classify. Too monumental to be only camp life. Too early to feel like later temple states. Too organized for old stereotypes of foragers. Too silent for easy meaning. AI systems are good at detecting pattern, but patterns are not souls. What they show us here is coordination, symbolic coding, wild resource dependence, repeated rebuilding, and a site logic that exceeds ordinary subsistence. What they cannot do is tell us exactly what the builders felt when they stood before the pillars. Still, the stones themselves suggest some possibilities. The male imagery on the pillars, the animal danger all around, the commanding hilltop, the wild feast remains, the absence of domestic softness in the great early circles. All of it pulls the mind toward ceremony, ordeal, initiation, death rites, hunting magic, ancestor presence, or some mixture of these too old to cleanly separate. This was not just a place to sleep. It was a place to become part of something larger and more frightening than sleep. And then there is the simple fact of labor again. Hunters and gatherers who move great pillars are making a statement about priority. In such societies, time and effort are expensive in the purest sense. People do not waste them lightly. If they carved foxes and boars and snakes into megaliths, if they shaped polished floors below ground level, if they rebuilt circles over generations, then they were telling us through stone that this work stood near the center of life itself. You know that feeling when a family spends everything it has on one ritual, one burial, one feast, one shrine, one house for the dead, because whatever else life contains, that act must be done. Gobekli Tepe feels like that, enlarged beyond the family into a whole ritual landscape. So let the threshold remain in front of you now. Wild gazelle bones in heaps, wild grains ground in stone basins. No simple farming village answer. No simple temple answer either. A hilltop sanctuary built by people still close to the hunting world. A place where the future of settlement may have been gathering, but had not yet hardened into fields and fences. That is where the next movement takes us, deeper into the structures themselves and the symbolic animal world cut across their surfaces. Because once we accept that hunters raised the stones, the carvings begin to matter even more. They are not decoration. They may be the nearest surviving fragments of the lost cosmology that made such labor feel necessary. Once we accept that hunters raised the stones, the spaces themselves begin to feel even stranger. Because if Gobekli Tepe had been built by settled farmers in a familiar village world, we might instinctively know where to place it in the old mental cabinet. Temple, meeting hall, storage center, elite precinct, something like that. But the site keeps resisting those tidy shelves. The architecture is too formal to be casual, too symbolic to be merely practical, too physically demanding to be accidental, and yet it is still old enough that every later category feels slightly borrowed, like a modern coat thrown over a much older body. Recently, Researchers used advanced AI models to process three-dimensional scans of the enclosures, pillar socket depths, wall curvatures, floor treatments, and load-bearing possibilities, asking a very simple question that turns out to be anything but simple. What kind of space did these builders think they were making? Open to the sky, covered in timber and hide, partly roofed, fully enclosed, purely ceremonial, seasonally occupied, or some shifting combination of all these states across time. The data did not answer with one clean sentence. Gobekli Tepe almost never does. But it did sharpen the debate, and in doing so it made the site feel more intimate, more habitable in one sense, and more eerie in another. If you stand above one of the great enclosures in imagination, the first impression is still descent. That matters. You do not simply walk into these spaces on level ground. You move down toward them. Stone walls rise around the lowered interior. The central pillars wait at the deepest emotional point of the design, drawing your eyes inward and downward at once. The movement itself feels ritualized. A hilltop open to sun and wind gives way to a contained circular world where the air would have been cooler, the sound more focused, and the carvings more powerful because the eye had fewer places to escape. I have always thought that descent changes thought. Even a few steps below the surrounding level can make the mind behave differently. You feel taken in, separated, chosen, perhaps, though that word is a little dangerous. At Gobekli Tepe, the lowered architecture may have done exactly that. The source transcript suggested houses of the divine, not domestic houses, and the more one sits with the enclosure form, the more that phrase begins to feel less poetic and more technical. These were spaces made to hold presence. The earliest excavators were strongly struck by what seemed absent. No obvious domestic hearths shaping the central monumental circles. No ordinary village floor plans wrapped around the great pillars. No kitchen logic strong enough to reduce the architecture to daily household routine. This absence guided Klaus Schmidt toward his influential interpretation. Gobekli Tepe, or at least its great early circles, was a sanctuary complex, a pilgrimage center, a ceremonial high place where people came together for rites, feasts, and collective labor before dispersing again into the wider world. That interpretation still carries real force, and the AI reconstructions have not dissolved it. In some ways, they have strengthened it. Pattern recognition across enclosure dimensions and pillar placements suggests a recurring design grammar, too consistent for casual construction. These were not one-off improvised gathering spots. There is planning here, repeated enough to imply remembered architectural rules. A proper special building tradition, already matured, already symbolically charged, already confident in how a sacred space should feel under the body. And yet later scholars began asking difficult questions, which is exactly what good archaeology should do. Could some of the enclosures have been roofed? Could wooden beams have crossed the spaces? Could hides, reed mats, or timber frameworks have created darker interiors? Could some structures have been more enclosed than the open sky sanctuary image allowed? When engineers and archaeologists started modeling roof loads and span possibilities, the answer was not absurdly no. In fact, for at least some spaces, roofing may have been structurally possible. That possibility changes the imagination of the site quite a lot. A roof would mean shadow. A roof would mean stronger acoustic containment. A roof would mean a shift from hilltop monument to interior chamber. A roof would mean the sky no longer dominated every ritual from above, and instead light would enter selectively, perhaps from openings, perhaps from doorways, perhaps from fire. If you slow that thought down, the emotional atmosphere changes almost at once. The pillars become less like outdoor markers and more like beings encountered in a controlled interior. The animal carvings become less decorative and more immersive. A snake relief in open sunlight is one thing. A snake relief half seen in torchlight under a timber roof is another thing entirely. Recently, acoustic simulations using AI-assisted spatial processing explored how enclosed and semi-enclosed versions of the main circles might have handled sound. The results remain interpretive, not final, but they are suggestive enough to matter. Voices may have thickened in the lower chambers. Rhythmic sound may have circled rather than dissipated. Drumming, stamping, trant, or even the simple repetition of many human breaths could have gathered a kind of sonic density under certain configurations. You know that feeling when a room begins listening back. That is the kind of feeling these models imply. Not a concert hall. Something older. A place where sound itself might have become part of ritual pressure. The floor adds another layer to that pressure. In some enclosures, the builders laid hard, polished, terrazzo-like surfaces, made with a lime plaster process so sophisticated that it still feels almost impolite this early in time. Smooth, pale flooring under a world of carved animals and towering pillars. That detail always slows me down. Someone mixed, spread, and finished those surfaces carefully. They wanted the ground under human feet to feel distinct from ordinary earth. Cleaner, harder, more deliberate. Every sacred tradition in the world eventually learns that floor is part of meaning. But Gobekli Tepe knew it already. Imagine stepping barefoot or in hide, wrapping on to such a surface after coming through dust outside. The difference would be immediate. Coolness underfoot. The smooth plane of a worked floor. A sensation of crossing from common ground into made ground. The source was right to dwell in those bodily contrasts, because ritual often begins there, where texture changes before doctrine can even be named. At the same time, more recent fieldwork and broader regional comparison have complicated the image of total emptiness between ceremonies. Some scholars now argue that the site may not have stood entirely abandoned between seasonal gatherings. Perhaps a small resident group, caretakers, specialists, workers, ritual custodians, lived at or near the complex year-round, maintaining the enclosures, preparing for large events, watching over the hill, managing tools, water, or stored materials. The evidence remains partial and debated, but it is not silly. Human monuments usually require human maintenance. And Gobekli Tepe was no small thing to maintain. AI comparison across micro-refuse patterns, wear zones, and movement corridors has added a little weight to this idea by identifying subtle, repeated activity areas near certain parts of the mound that do not read as purely theatrical. Again, caution matters. A model finding pattern is not the same as a written confession from a resident caretaker, but it suggests that the hill may have had rhythms more continuous than the earliest dramatic pilgrimage narrative allowed. Not a normal village, perhaps. Not empty between feasts either. Something in between, which may be even more interesting. I have always liked in-between places. They tend to be the places where history is actually made. Gobekli Tepe may have been one of them. Not fully settlement, not fully absence, not fully temple in the later urban sense, not merely campsite. A maintained sacred complex on the threshold of a changing world. That threshold quality appears in the architecture itself. Some of the earliest and grandest circles are the most impressive. Later structures often grow smaller, more rectilinear, or otherwise different in mood. This matters because it suggests transformation rather than static tradition. The people who built Gobekli Tepe were not repeating themselves mindlessly. They were adjusting. The sacred grammar stayed alive, but the emphasis shifted. AI sequencing of architectural features across dated layers has reinforced this sense of a site moving through phases of confidence, adaptation, reduction, and eventual closure. And closure is perhaps the strangest architectural act of all. The enclosures were not simply left to decay. They were deliberately backfilled. Tons of earth, stone, refuse, fragments, and debris were packed into them until the circles disappeared beneath the mound. To modern minds, this can feel like destruction, but the source was wise not to frame it too simply. Burial is also a form of preservation. Sealing a chamber can be reverence. Covering a sacred space can mean it has completed its use, not that it has been hated. Recently, fill pattern analysis run through machine learning classification has shown that the burial deposits were neither random erosion nor casual dumping. They were structured enough to look intentional, and in some cases, surprisingly careful. That thought changes how the architecture feels. The circles were not only built as special spaces, they were ended as special spaces. Opened, used, renewed, then closed. There is a ritual life cycle in that. A building tradition that knows not only how to raise sacred ground, but how to return it to earth. Let us stay a little longer within one of those circles before the fill arrives. The central pillars standing in hush, the ring of outer stones around them, wall faces carrying memory of hands, animal forms just beneath your gaze, the sky above, or perhaps a roof of beams and hides depending on the phase, a floor smoother than the dust outside, a sound made low and repeated until it becomes environment. Human bodies gathered in attention. No writing. No sermon preserved. Only arrangement, pressure, repetition, and stone. That is why Gobekli Tepe refuses reduction. It is not only the age. It is the architecture of intention. Advanced AI has helped sharpen dimensions, load possibilities, usus zones, and enclosure relationships, but in a way that almost increases the mystery. The more structured the site appears, the harder it becomes to dismiss as primitive improvisation. The builders understood special space profoundly. They could shape movement, focus sight, manipulate descent, perhaps manipulate sound, and distinguish sacred surfaces from ordinary ground. This is architecture before architecture is supposed to exist. And perhaps that is why the site still feels slightly supernatural, even when one rejects every supernatural theory about it. Human beings without metal, without writing, without established urban states, created chambers that still manage attention across 12,000 years. That is not magic. It is skill so old it no longer fits our favorite timelines. The next step is to listen to the carvings themselves, because the architecture creates the frame, but the animals and symbols create the mood inside it. Boars, foxes, snakes, vultures, the scorpions, birds, phallic hints, skull traces, all of it pressed into stone with enough confidence that the site begins to resemble a lost myth told without words. If the enclosures are the body of Gobekli Tepe, the carvings are its nearest remaining voice. Once the architecture has done its work, the carvings take over. That is the moment Gobekli Tepe stops feeling merely monumental and begins to feel inhabited by thought. Not our thought. Theirs. Theirs in fragments, in symbols, in cold relief lines cut into limestone by hands that left no names and no written explanation. Recently, researchers used image recognition systems trained on thousands of detailed scans from Gobekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Nevali Kori, and other prehistoric visual corpora to map animal clustering, carving depth, stylistic recurrence, and positional emphasis. The models did not decode a lost language. That would be too easy. And Gobekli Tepe does not believe in easy gifts. But they did reveal something deeply important. The imagery is patterned, deliberate, weighted, composed. These are not random creatures drifting through stone. This is a symbolic world. The source transcript moved first toward the boars, and that feels right. In one enclosure, boars appear with such force that they stop feeling like ordinary fauna and begin feeling like presences. There is something inherently unnerving about boar imagery. Thick shoulders, tusks, sudden violence. A body built low and powerful, familiar and yet almost armored by attitude alone. To carve a boar into ritual stone is to choose menace, appetite, and wild force as one of the faces of the sacred. The AI models showed this concentration clearly, enough to strengthen the argument that certain enclosures may have emphasized distinct thematic clusters, rather than simply collecting whatever animal forms carvers found available. If you imagine standing in that enclosure at night, the boars become even stranger. Firelight moving weakly across the surface, tusks catching brightness for a moment, then slipping back into darkness. The sense that the wall is not flat, but waiting. I have always thought that animal reliefs become more powerful in partial light because they recover movement. A boar in full museum illumination is a subject. A boar in flicker light is an arrival. Then there are the foxes. Slender, cunning, always slightly unsettling because they belong to the threshold between ordinary predator and trickster imagination. On the pillars, foxes seem almost to slide along the stone, elongated, purposeful, difficult to pin into one clean symbolic box. Some scholars have suggested totemic significance. Others see hunting associations, group identity markers, or creatures of passage between zones, settlement and wild, living and dead, day and night. We cannot be sure. But the repetition matters. Repetition is intention. Intention is meaning, even if the exact meaning has gone silent. And then the snakes. The source was right to slow down when it reached the snakes, because they changed the emotional temperature of the site almost at once. A fox can still feel worldly. A boar can still feel like dangerous prey. Snakes tilt the whole symbolic field downward and inward. Underworld. Death. Sudden hidden threat. The line of the body itself carries unease. Thin, cold, directional. The kind of creature that seems to arrive from beneath rather than from ahead. When modern AI clustered the site imagery, snakes stood out, not only for their repetition, but for their visual aggression. They often seem to press, surround, descend, or multiply. This does not prove an underworld cult in any clean sense, but it does strongly suggest that danger, mortality, and contact with the unseen were not marginal themes here. They were central. You know that feeling when a symbol is old enough that its meaning has died, but its emotional charge survives. Snakes at Gobekli Tepe are like that. We may not know the doctrine. The skin still crawls a little. Vultures make the atmosphere darker still. Few animals carry death so openly, while remaining so sacred in human imagination. They descend from above, but feed on what the living have lost. In many ancient traditions, vultures hover between purification, exposure, sky burial, soul travel, and the terrifying honesty of bodies returning to the food chain. At Gobekli Tepe, they appear beside headless or damaged human implications, strongly enough that scholars have long suspected excarnation. Skull, cults, or ritual treatment of the dead may be involved somewhere in the symbolic field. Again, caution. Nothing here should be preached as certainty. Yet the converging evidence is hard to ignore. Vulture and skull together rarely belong to cheerful domesticity. Recently, AI comparison with other Near Eastern mortuary imagery strengthened that impression by showing how often birds of death cluster in positions of symbolic emphasis when human fragmentation or head imagery is nearby. The system cannot say, "This means sky burial." It cannot say, "This means ancestor exposure." But it can say, "This motif behaves like mortuary language more often than chance would predict." That is already enough to deepen the hush. Let us stay there for a moment. A stone vulture under dim light. Wings angled. Beak alert. A carved line where a human form seems absent or diminished. The silence around such an image would have been part of the ritual. I feel almost certain of that, even though certainty is a dangerous luxury at this site. Some symbols do not ask to be explained quickly. They ask to be endured. Scorpions appear too, another creature that turns the emotional field away from comfort and toward alertness. Danger, desert edge, sting, threshold, the body threatened by something small and sudden. Birds of many kinds. Cranes, perhaps, long-legged and strange. Gazelles, which pull the imagery briefly back toward the hunted landscape of life and food. Yet even they do not fully soften the atmosphere. There is almost no sense here that the carvers wanted a complete inventory of ordinary nature. They wanted selected beings. Charged beings. Beings that belong to a mythic grammar we can only overhear. The source also mentioned the strong male coding at the site, and that too deserves care. Many of the anthropomorphic pillars seem male, or at least are marked by belts, loincloths, and bodily cues that push interpretation in that direction. Explicit or semi-explicit phallic imagery appears in some associated sculpture. Female forms are far rarer than many would expect if the old mother goddess stereotype were doing all the explanatory work. Gobekli Tepe seems to resist that stereotype sharply. This is not a lush fertility shrine in the sentimental sense. Its energy is more severe than that, more dangerous, more bound up with hunting, death, masculine display, ritual ordeal, or some social order in which male symbolism dominated public sacred expression. That does not mean women were absent from the life of the site, only that the surviving stone world speaks in a gendered register, more aggressive and more austere than popular imagination often expects from deep prehistory. The AI motif models reinforced this by identifying repeated associations between certain bodily cues, predatory animals, and central compositional zones. Symbolism here seems power-saturated, not nurturing in any simple way. And then we come to the skull evidence. One of the most quietly disturbing aspects of Gobekli Tepe. Human skull fragments have been found, some showing modifications, cut marks, drilled features, or handling patterns that suggest the heads of the dead may have mattered in special ways. The source touched this with admirable restraint, because it is easy to turn skull cult theory into lurid entertainment. That would be a mistake. The real darkness is gentler and older than sensationalism. Human heads across many ancient societies carry identity, ancestor presence, enemy power, lineage, memory, and the dangerous threshold between person and remains. At Gobekli Tepe, the skull traces suggest that the dead were not simply disposed of and forgotten. They remained socially active in some ritual sense. Advanced AI classification of cut mark patterns and surface modifications on cranial fragments, especially when compared with reference data from other early Near Eastern sites, has strengthened the case that at least some skulls were intentionally altered or curated. That does not tell us exactly why. Ancestor veneration, ritual display, mortuary processing, symbolic removal from the body, all remain possible. But it pushes us further into the realization that Gobekli Tepe was a place where the living may have stood very near the dead, perhaps literally. I think that is why the site feels so dreamlike. Not because it is vague, but because its fragments keep converging on the kinds of boundaries dreams love most. Human and animal, feast and death, body and spirit, sky and underworld, living flesh and carved stone. It is a threshold machine. The source also mentioned cups, hollows, stepping stones, and peculiar architectural features that seem to have structured movement or held offerings. Liquids, perhaps blood, perhaps water, perhaps something less dramatic but no less meaningful. We should stay humble here. Interpretation can outrun evidence so quickly at Gobekli Tepe that it is almost embarrassing. Still, when AI spatial models compare these features across enclosures, they often appear in relation to focal carvings and movement routes, rather than as random accidents of stonework. The site was choreographed. People were meant to stand here, move there, face this, perhaps avoid that. Ritual is often just architecture teaching the body where meaning happens. And that teaching would have been amplified by story. This may be the hardest missing piece to bear. Gobekli Tepe almost certainly had myth. It is impossible to imagine such a site without myth. The carvings are too dense. The animal world is too patterned. The labor is too collective. The spaces are too charged. Yet the myths themselves are gone. No text survives. No prayer. No priestly explanation. Only stone and pattern. Recently, some teams have used narrative clustering models to explore whether the repeated pairings of certain animals and body forms imply structured visual storytelling rather than isolated symbolic tokens. The models suggest recurring motif neighborhoods, which is a dry way of saying that some images prefer to live near certain other images. But story is still beyond recovery in any full sense. Still, you can feel it. A child standing beside an elder, staring at a snake carved beneath a vulture. A hand pointing. A spoken tale about what the fox did at the edge of the camp. A warning about the boar that belongs not only to the hunt but to the dead. A chant naming the beings in order. A dance circling the pillars until the creatures on the stone become participants rather than carvings. Honestly, that is where Gobekli Tepe becomes almost unbearably human. Not in the data table, not in the carbon date, but in the realization that these carvings once made sense to someone with the intimacy our own symbols have for us. They were not mysterious to their makers. They were obvious enough to build around. The mystery belongs to us because we arrived late. That lateness is why AI is helpful but not sovereign here. It can identify grouping, recurrence, symmetry, erosion sequence, iconographic emphasis. It can tell us that some enclosures seem organized around particular creatures more heavily than others. It can show that the site is visually intentional, but it cannot dream the dream for them. It cannot recover the final feeling of standing in the dark below the pillars and knowing exactly what the fox meant, exactly why the vulture mattered, exactly how the dead moved through the ritual story of the hill. Perhaps nothing ever will. So let the carvings remain partly unsolved. The boar holding its low, violent power. The fox slipping through the symbolic edge of things. The snake carrying cold underworld intention. The vulture watching from above what the living would rather not watch. The skull fragments whispering that the dead were not gone here, only transformed into another social fact. The male bodies and stone standing motionless at the center of it all. This is the nearest surviving voice of Gobekli Tepe, and it speaks in animals. Danger, death, masculinity, and threshold imagery. Not a gentle pastoral world. A sacred wilderness compressed into limestone. The next movement of the story has to widen from this lost symbolic chamber into the bigger human background behind it, because Gobekli Tepe did not come from nowhere. It rose out of a much longer Ice Age history of gathering. Art, feasting, shamans, burial, and the slow revolution of mind that prepared hunter societies to make monuments before farming had fully changed the earth. To understand why Gobekli Tepe exists at all, the story has to step backward before it can step forward. That is the only honest way to do it. A place like this looks impossible when it is torn away from the much older human past that made it thinkable. Recently, Researchers used advanced AI models to compare Gobekli Tepe with huge archaeological datasets from the Levant, Anatolia, and Ice Age Europe, including Natufian sites, cave art, zones, mammoth bone structures, ritual burials, seasonal gathering camps, and symbolic object distributions. What the systems returned was not a lonely miracle. It was a long ancestry of sacred behavior, reaching far behind the first pillars on the hill. That changes the emotional shape of the site at once. Gobekli Tepe was never the first time human beings felt awe. It was never the first time they treated stone as more than stone. It was never the first time they gathered around death, dangerous animals, feast fire, memory, and the invisible pressure of a shared story. The source was careful about that, and it should be. What happened on this hill was not an isolated lightning strike. It was a culmination, or at least one surviving crest in a much older tide of symbolic life. The landscape helps explain why that crest rose here. The post-glacial world of southeastern Anatolia was not the empty, punishing wasteland people often imagine when they hear the word prehistoric. It was rich in exactly the wrong way for simple historical storytelling. Rich enough to gather. Rich enough to feast. Rich enough to support moving groups who knew the behavior of wild grain, gazelle, boar, nuts, birds, and seasonal water. Recently, climate and vegetation data fed into AI-assisted paleo-environmental models have strengthened this picture. Pistachio woodland, wild cereal stands, animal movement corridors. A world with enough ecological generosity to support concentrated ritual life, yet still edged by instability. That last part matters. Stability and fear often grow together. The younger Dryas still shadows the broader story here. That late cold reversal that reminded people the earth could shift its mood with very little warning. A landscape may feed you beautifully for years and still carry the memory that it can turn hard. The source uses that tension well. Gobekli Tepe belongs to a world that was promising but not secure. The old hunting life still held people. The new agricultural life was beginning to stir. The sacred often grows strongest at such thresholds, when people feel both abundance and fragility at once. This is where the Natufians enter the story, and they are essential. The Natufian world in the Levant already showed that hunter-gatherers could be far more settled, symbolic, and socially layered than old stereotypes allowed. They buried their dead. They built. They used groundstone. They returned to particular places. They cared where bodies lay and where memory accumulated. In other words, they had already begun teaching archaeology, the lesson Gobekli Tepe would later force upon it more brutally. Foragers were never simple in the childish sense. They already knew how to make place thick with meaning. If you slow that down, it becomes almost tender. A burial beneath a house floor. Ochre on bone. A stone blade laid beside someone who will not rise again. A return to the same terrace. The same spring. The same patch of earth, because life there had become not only useful, but emotionally binding. Gobekli Tepe does not come from nowhere. It rises from a world where human beings were already practicing the transformation of land into memory. And the source moves even farther back than that, which I think is one of its strongest decisions, because once you step behind the Natufians, the human past begins shimmering with older rehearsals of the same sacred impulse. Ice Age caves, painted with animals, portable figurines, mammoth bone circles, ochre burials, seasonal aggregation sites where many groups came together, perhaps to exchange mates, stories, ritual roles, and obligations as much as food. We do not need a simple, direct lineage from every painted cave to every carved pillar at Gobekli Tepe. Prehistory is rarely so polite, but the AI comparisons across these broader symbolic behaviors reveal recurrent clustering, communal gathering, dangerous animal imagery, repeated place use, and investment in ritual or identity work beyond daily subsistence. I have always loved that idea. Humanity was training for Gobekli Tepe for a very long time without knowing it. Every burial carried with care, every dangerous animal painted with reverence or fear, every seasonal fire around which a group listened to a story that made the dead present again. Every gathering where people labored together for reasons no hunger chart could fully explain. All of it was practice for a species learning that invisible things could be given durable form. The source also gestures toward the sapient paradox, and that is worth pausing over. Anatomically modern humans existed long before monumental symbolic worlds like Gobekli Tepe became visible in the record. The body was already there. The mind was already there in its biological potential. But the social ignition took longer. Symbolic life, cumulative ritual, dense communal meaning. These had to ripen. Gobekli Tepe may be one answer to that paradox. Not because it solves it fully, but because it shows what happens when a long-prepared human imagination finally externalizes itself at large scale. You can almost feel that ripening if you let the older world gather behind the hill. A cave painter deep in darkness, firelight jumping on stone, a burial marked with ochre. A ritual specialist, or someone like one, watching birds circle over the dead and feeling that the air above the body is thick with significance. A seasonal meeting place where many groups arrive and repeat the same gestures until the place itself begins to seem conscious. None of those scenes is Gobekli Tepe, and yet every one of them makes Gobekli Tepe less impossible. That is why the site should not be treated as the beginning of religion in any loud, simple sense. The source resists that, and wisely so. Gobekli Tepe is better understood as one magnificent surviving node in a much older sacred web. A place where old ritual habits, death concerns, animal symbolism, seasonal gathering, and new forms of social concentration met one another on the edge of changing subsistence. And the regional picture now makes that even clearer. Gobekli Tepe is not alone. Garahan Tepe, Nevali Kori, and other stone hill sites show that southeastern Anatolia held a wider world of megalithic experimentation. Symbolic stone bodies, special enclosures, and ritual landscapes. AI-based network analysis of site plans, topography, carving types, and material culture has made that impossible to ignore. This was not one hill having one strange dream. It was a cultural horizon. The human mind at work here was already capable of long travel, memory across generations, technical stone labor, and the emotional organization required to persuade many people to do exhausting things for non-practical reasons. That last phrase matters. Non-practical reasons. Or rather, reasons practical in a deeper human way. Cohesion, mourning, initiation, fear, control, alliance, divine negotiation, cosmology. The old academic habit of separating practical and spiritual life too sharply begins looking weak in the face of Gobekli Tepe. Human beings have always done practical things for sacred reasons and sacred things for practical reasons. The two feed each other. That is probably why the site feels so alive in theories of feasting and gathering. Seasonal congregation did not begin on this hill. Many human societies long before farming likely assembled periodically in places where food, ritual, and social transformation all converged. A gathering is never only about eating. It is about seeing others again, measuring status, exchanging partners, settling tensions, sharing knowledge, reminding everyone that they belong to something broader than one camp or one bloodline. Gobekli Tepe may have magnified that ancient function until it required architecture. Imagine one such gathering in the long green edge of the post-glacial world. Groups arriving from different valleys. The same hill appearing over and over in memory each year or each season. Children seeing the pillars for the first time. Elders knowing the songs. Hunters bringing carcasses. Stone workers already at labor. A sense that the place is both familiar and dangerous, because sacred places often are. Not safe exactly. Necessary. Honestly, that may be why Gobekli Tepe still unsettles people more than almost any prehistoric site. It reveals that human beings did not wait for cities to become ceremonial at scale. They did not wait for kings to become organized. They did not wait for farming to become ideological. The sacred was already capable of pulling large numbers of people into one focused labor system. That is not a side note to civilization. It may be one of its roots. The source handles this beautifully by keeping the mystery alive. It does not tell us that one neat cause explains everything. It lets abundance, climate stress, ritual memory, social glue, mortuary tradition, and symbolic inheritance all remain in the room together. That feels right. Prehistory is usually less a straight line than a knot. Gobekli Tepe is one of those knots, and the more evidence we bring to it, old excavation notes, new LiDAR, AI pattern analysis, climate models, iconographic comparisons, the more the knot becomes visible without fully coming undone. So stay with the longer ancestry a moment more. Let the hill feel surrounded by the dead of much older centuries. Cave painters, mammoth bone builders, natufiamburiers, gatherers of wild grain, tellers of dangerous animal stories, all standing somewhere behind the people who first raised the T-shaped stones. Gobekli Tepe belongs to them too. It is their descendant, their echo, their sudden hard limestone flowering. And once that is clear, the final question becomes almost unbearable. If such a place drew from so much older sacred life, if it gathered so many strands of the human mind into one monumental experiment, why did it end? Why did the circles shrink? Why were the great enclosures buried? And what exactly was being closed when the earth was carried back into those sacred chambers? The final mystery of Gobekli Tepe is not only why it was built, it is why it was closed. That may be the most haunting detail of all. A place can die by neglect, by war, by weather, by flood, by the slow fraying of memory. Gobekli Tepe seems to have experienced something more intimate. The great circles were filled in. Stone, rubble, refuse, earth, fragments, layer after layer, until the chambers disappeared beneath the mound. Recently, researchers fed fill composition, artifact density, sediment signatures, and deposition sequences into AI classification models, and the results supported what many archaeologists already suspected. The enclosures were not casually lost. They were deliberately buried. That one fact changes the emotional tone of everything that came before it. These circles were not simply abandoned when life moved elsewhere. They were put away, covered, sealed, returned to Earth by human decision. And before we can sit properly with that ending, we have to gather the reasons this hill may have mattered so much during its long sacred life. The source transcript laid out several theories and did the wise thing by not pretending they must cancel one another. Feasting is one. The animal bone evidence almost insists on that. Great quantities of wild gazelle, wild boar, other game, communal processing, repeated episodes of intense consumption. AI-assisted zoo archaeological analysis has strengthened the impression that these were not only ordinary meals, but organized high-volume events. Feasts bind people. Feasts create memory. Feasts make labor bearable. Feasts turn the dangerous sacred into something shared by the whole body. Imagine the hill at dusk during one of those gatherings. Smoke carrying the smell of roasting meat. Children drifting close to the enclosures and being pulled gently back. Great stone bodies catching low firelight. Voices from many groups folding into one sound. Laughter somewhere. Fear somewhere else. Fat hissing. Drums, perhaps, or clappers, or only hands beating rhythm against hide and wood. No written liturgy. No official doctrine preserved. Only appetite, labor, performance, and repetition. Enough repetition that a place becomes more than a place. The source also emphasizes ritual as social glue. That phrase can sound dry until you imagine the actual work. Quarrying stone, hauling pillars, carving reliefs, digging enclosures, preparing food for many people, keeping peace across bands that may otherwise compete. None of that happens without a force stronger than convenience. Ritual can be exactly that force. It can persuade people to act together because the action no longer belongs to this household or that household. It belongs to a larger, invisible order. Recently, AI-based labor simulations comparing pillar mass, transport distances, work group sizes, and seasonal resource availability have made one point very clear. Gobekli Tepe required cooperation beyond ordinary domestic scale. That scale itself is part of the revelation. And once many people must cooperate, roles begin to sharpen. The source does not shout the word priest. and that restraint is good. But the architecture and the symbolic density make it very hard to imagine a site like this without some people knowing more than others. Some people guiding movement. Some people remembering sequence. Some people deciding when the enclosure is opened, when the feast begins, when the story is told, when the dead are addressed, when the animals carved in stone become more than decoration. Modern AI movement modeling, using entry points, sightlines, and focal nodes, suggests that the enclosures naturally create positions of authority. A figure standing in the right place between the central pillars would become the center of human attention almost automatically. Architecture can create ritual status before language formalizes it. Then there is ecstasy. The source allowed that possibility to breathe, and I think it should remain. A site like Gobekli Tepe, with descent into enclosed space, heavy carved symbolism, animal danger, possible acoustic concentration, and repeated large gatherings, lends itself to altered states. Dance, chant, fasting, drumming, repetitive movement, the bodily pressure of many people believing together. We cannot prove the exact techniques, but human ritual rarely reaches this scale without seeking some transformation of ordinary perception. The hill may have been a machine for changing how reality felt. I have always thought the central pillars matter most in that regard. They stand still while everything human around them moves. Fire flickers, drums pulse, breath quickens, shadows lengthen, voices rise, and the stone persons remain unchanged at the center, as if they belong to another register of time. In such a setting, it would not take much for a crowd to feel that the invisible had drawn close. And then there is the larger theory that still unsettles modern histories the most. Perhaps places like Gobekli Tepe helped create the social conditions for agriculture. The source handled this carefully, which is exactly right. Maybe repeated ritual gatherings demanded more reliable food supplies. Maybe the effort needed to feed workers, pilgrims, and celebrants made wild harvesting feel too unstable. Maybe cultivation and storage became more attractive because sacred life had become logistically expensive. In that version, religion or ritual is not the offspring of farming. It is one of the forces pulling farming into existence. Others read the direction differently. Perhaps experimental cultivation already existed nearby and helped support the gatherings without dominating the site itself. Perhaps the hill was a ceremonial node in a wider world, already changing in its relationship to plants and settlement. Perhaps both pressures worked at once. Human beings rarely change one thing at a time. Subsistence shapes meaning. Meaning shapes subsistence. The loop is probably the real story. The source even hints at a darker possibility. That ritual may have delayed full adoption of farming in one sense, because the older hunter world remained too symbolically alive to surrender quickly. That idea has a sad beauty to it. A people do not leave a world only because a new economy becomes available. They leave when the old symbols no longer hold them as tightly. Gobekli Tepe may stand at exactly that point, where the old sacred grammar of wild animals, hilltop gatherings, death, and communal feasting was still strong, even while another future was already pressing at the edges. And then, after all of that, the burial. It is impossible not to return there. Basket after basket of earth, broken stone, debris from former use, the floor disappearing slowly, a fox relief sinking lower in the wall line, the central pillars standing above the rising fill for a time, then less, then finally gone from sight. Advanced AI fill analysis has suggested pattern deposition rather than random dumping, which means the closing may itself have been ritualized. This was not only the end of activity. It may have been a final act of sacred labor. You know that feeling when a household closes a room after grief. Not because the room means nothing, but because it means too much to continue using as before. Gobekli Tepe has that same atmosphere. The circles may have been buried because they were completed, exhausted, surpassed, or made dangerous by a changing world. The source wisely avoids claiming certainty, but the emotional logic of closure remains powerful. The chronology sharpens that feeling. The biggest and earliest circles appear to be among the most impressive. Later phases are often smaller, more reduced, or differently organized. This suggests transformation rather than continuous triumphant growth. Something was contracting. Something was changing in the ritual world of the hill. The monumental age of the great central enclosures may already have been understood as belonging to an older order by the time the burial began. There may even be distant echoes afterward, though here caution matters deeply. The source mentioned possible survivals of skull traditions, primal holy mounds, two-headed figures, and even much later Mesopotamian memories like Dooku. None of this proves a direct, uninterrupted thread. Prehistory almost never permits such convenience. But symbols can drift a very long way. A sacred hill, a dangerous bird, a treated skull, a body divided from its head. These things can outlive the world that first arranged them. I find that possibility strangely consoling, not because it gives us closure, but because it lets silence remain fertile. The people who buried Gobekli Tepe may have known that the stones were going quiet without believing the meanings would vanish entirely. Meanings rarely vanish. They thin, split, travel, and hide in new forms. So in the end, we return to the mound itself. Wind over pale grass. A dry hill under a broad Anatolian sky. A few enclosures uncovered beneath modern shelter. Most of the monument still asleep below. That may be the most fitting ending imaginable. Gobekli Tepe changed the order of human history while still keeping most of itself hidden. We have models now. We have AI cross comparisons. We have climate reconstructions, iconographic clustering, movement simulations, fill pattern analysis, and all the patient force of archaeology. And still, the hill remains partly beyond us. Perhaps it should. A site born from ritual secrecy, from symbolic pressure, from dangerous animals and communal awe, does not owe us total explanation. It has already given enough. It has shown that hunter-gatherers could gather at astonishing scale. It has shown that monumental ritual did not politely wait for settled farming life. It has shown that the human imagination was architecturally ambitious long before cities and kings made such ambition familiar. And it has shown that one age can bury itself, carefully, reverently, and still whisper upward through the soil 12,000 years later. So let the fires go out now. Let the feasting voices thin and vanish. Let the drums stop. Let the final baskets of fill be carried in. Let the carved boars, foxes, snakes, vultures, and human-shaped stones sink back under earth. Let the stories loosen from mouths and move into silence. And let the hill remain where it has always remained, on the horizon, patient, half hidden, still carrying the pressure of a sacred world that helped change what human beings were willing to build before history learned how to write it down. Good night.